All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, let's see. Oh, I am on. Yes, I can hear myself. Is that good? Can you all hear me okay? Okay, awesome. I haven't quite decided where I'm going to stand yet, because if I go behind the podium, you're not going to be able to see me, so I may just kind of wander around a little bit. But I wanted to say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come and speak to a group of parents today about something that I'm very passionate about and something that is very clearly a big issue. I mean, whether we're talking about 3-year-olds or whether we're talking about 18-year-olds, anxiety disorders and anxiety in kids is a growing problem, and I think it's something that deserves some attention. So kudos to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and listen to this. And so my goal for this presentation, one, is to talk to you a little bit about what anxiety disorders in kids look like, the types of disorders that we see, what some of the symptoms are, what to be on the lookout for, and then also to shift focus as what can we do about it? From a parent perspective, what can we do? From a school perspective, what can we do? So I hope that you leave here at least with some better understanding and some tools in your toolbox to take home. One of the things I'm really bad at is time management in presentations like this. So I'm either going to be really nervous and I'm going to get through it all in 15 minutes. I'm going to try not to do that. Or I'm going to start talking and telling stories, and I'm going to be like going on and on and on and on and on. But thankfully there's a clock in the back, so I'm going to try to be mindful of your time. And my goal is, or I hope that we can take some time for questions. I will be happy to stay around a little bit after the presentation is over. Sometimes it's not easy to ask questions about stuff like this in a group full of people, especially your peers, people that you know. So I'll be happy to hang around if you have something that you'd like to ask me later. All right, let's see. Let's see if we can make the clicker work. Oh, well, it worked from the back of the room. Let's try it. There we go. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so anxiety is one of those things that's kind of hard to define. You know, you ask a kid in an assessment, are you anxious? And they kind of look at you with a blank stare. And they're like, I don't really understand what that means. Even adults, it's hard to put it into words what anxiety is and what it feels like. And even the definitions don't really help us. You know, I looked up some the other day when I was putting this together, and it said, a general feeling of unease. And I was like, that's not really super helpful. You know, unease, what does that mean, unease? But what we know is that it's multifaceted. Anxiety affects you cognitively. It affects your thoughts, right? So worry is one of the primary symptoms of what we think of as anxiety. It also affects your emotions, the way you feel, the way you handle things like tension and stress. And we use a lot of these words interchangeably, and that's okay. Stress and anxiety, it's really the same construct that we're talking about. It also affects us physiologically. Anybody that's ever had a panic attack or felt like they couldn't breathe after, you know, a stressful situation certainly understands how quickly an anxious situation can impact the way that you feel physically. So when we think about what is anxiety, it's all of that. In a cultural context, there are a couple of points I wanted to make here that I'm seeing in my own practice. One is that anxiety is epidemic right now. I mean, we could call this the age of anxiety. I mean, it's ballooning in adults, it's ballooning in kids. There's statistics, and I had some notes at the bottom of the slides that I can't see right now, so I'm just going to kind of wing it, so bear with me. 40 million adults, 18.1% of the adult population likely would meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. So 1 in 5, right? 1 in 5. Only about 30% of those adults are getting any kind of active treatment. So there are literally millions of adults walking around with unmanaged anxiety and stress. That's a lot of parents, right? The stats for kids, about 7.1% of kids age 7 to 13 would meet criteria for a clinical anxiety disorder. That compares with about 3% for depression. So we can see about twice as many kids are being diagnosed with anxiety as depression. When you get to adolescence, the number like quadruples. It's more like 28%. I mean, literally like 1 in 4 of our teenagers would meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. So it's kind of epidemic proportions. It's only growing. You know, a whole different presentation would be talking about why we're seeing that. I could spend hours talking about just the factors culturally of why we're seeing that, but that's not really why we're here today. A couple of things that I am seeing that is really interesting. One is that I'm seeing anxiety disorders in kids who are younger and younger. I don't know whether that's the more school-related stress. I don't know whether that's more access to information at earlier and earlier ages, whether their parents are more stressed, but younger and younger, kids at 6, 7, and 8 that are meeting criteria for anxiety disorders, which is even different from 10 years ago when I started practicing. The other thing I'm seeing with adolescents is that we're wearing anxiety kind of like this cool kid badge. Now, instead of not wanting to talk about our mental health or any kind of concerns or problems that we have, it's like the cool thing to do to talk about, well, I'm anxious, well, I have OCD, well, my trauma is worse than your trauma. So now we kind of see this very casual kind of viewpoint about anxiety, which, one, it's good that they're talking about it, but two, it's not good that they're minimizing it. So that's kind of just an interesting thing that we see with the adolescents that we work with in our practice. Situational anxiety versus clinical. We all have situational anxiety, right? Every single one of us in this room has been through some sort of situation, whether it be a job interview or a standardized test or a health situation or a, family stressor, a job loss, anything that's created feelings and problems associated with anxiety. And a lot of people, those are transient, right? We deal with it, we move on until the next stressor happens. A clinical anxiety disorder impairs our functioning consistently, significantly, and over a period of time, right? So we want to see these symptoms persist past the point of a stressor, past the point of any kind of life event, and over a period of time. And it varies by different disorder, but it's typically a 4 to 8 week period that we need to see these symptoms almost every day. So is anxiety always bad? Anybody? No? Okay. Honestly, I have parents that say, I wish my kid had a little more anxiety. Our kids that are hard to motivate or hard to get going or just don't seem to care about anything. Anxiety in some ways is very functional for us, right? It's that like push in our back that says, you need to go do this, or that's important to you. So in the right amounts, it can serve us really well. Biologically, genetically, anxiety protects us from threats. We think about early humans. Why did we have anxiety? Well, it's the fight or flight response. It's our cortisol response when a perceived danger, there's an impending army coming and you're going to have to clean up your camp and move really quickly, right? You want your body to react in those situations. So it's protective. Anxiety also connects us to what we value. We typically don't worry about things we don't care about, right? So, if we're stressed about our family and our loved ones, somebody's having a health problem, or our kids are stressed about their grades, part of that is because it's important to them. So sometimes our anxiety kind of clues us in to what it is that's really important to us in our life. And on the flip side of that, sometimes it spotlights connections to where those things don't match up, right? Maybe I made a really poor decision that isn't in line with my values, and I'm afraid I'm gonna get caught, right? So I'm worried that I did something that goes against my values or what's important to me, and now I'm worried about the ramifications of the consequences of that. Okay, so just a little overview. Okay, so what's normal, right? What's normal? And in my line of work, normal is a bad word. We don't really use normal in my office because there's no such thing. But there are certain developmental degrees of what we expect in children in terms of anxious distress. 0 to 2, right? The big thing is separation anxiety and stranger danger. We would expect an 18-month toddler to not want to separate from mom to go into the nursery at church. That is normal, right? We are going to expect some bedtime stalling behaviors because we don't want to be left in our room by ourselves. Loud noises, right? Our kids who are the fire truck or the siren, those things are very, very typical and appropriate in that age. Let's see. Early childhood is a little different. That's where we go into imaginary land, right? We live in, Lego land or race car land or pretty princess land, and we start to think about scary imaginary things. our monsters, our ghosts, our villains in our Disney movies, the things that we're afraid of when we're this age. We may also be afraid of sleeping alone. This is where a lot of our kids, they're crawling in the bed when they wake up at night. Unfortunately, that's pretty normal at this age. If it persists over a long period of time, it's a different issue. But darkness, getting hurt, big animals, right? Those are all things that are very, very typical. Going to the doctor. We go to the doctor, we get a shot. We don't like it. Very, very normal. Okay, middle childhood is where things get a little more interesting, and this happens about 7 or 8 years old. And it kind of coincides with developmental changes in going from this imaginary worldview into a more realistic worldview, right? All of a sudden, we're not living in pretty princess land anymore. We now understand that bad things happen. Weather can be scary, right? Maybe I know somebody whose house got damaged in a storm. That's a very real fear, especially around here. Maybe I've lost a grandparent, right? Maybe somebody in my family has had a health problem. I can read now. So maybe I've read some things on mom's phone when she wasn't looking that I wasn't supposed to be reading, or caught some glimpses of the news, things that have happened that are scary. So it's kind of that introduction to real life and world events and things that, in the world that can be scary and frightening. Also, that's when we start to think about social competence. What if my friends don't like me? What if I say the wrong thing? I'm being left out. And also, that's where we start to see the beginning of our perfectionistic kids who are afraid of making mistakes. Because oftentimes that's where we start to see grades for the first time, or we start to see kids who are being evaluated or have the opportunity to compare themselves with their peers. Let's see. So that goes on until we hit about adolescence. And honestly, those things just tend to continue and get more pervasive in adolescence. We start to think about world events. Social competence becomes even more important, right? In adolescence, your worldview shifts from your family to your peers. So your friends are much more important than your parents are in terms of the way you feel about yourself, your self-worth, your self-value, all of those things. We may be afraid of new experiences, right? In adolescence, there are a lot of things you're expected to do that maybe you've never had to do before. Thinking about visiting colleges, or, maybe it's, you got to start doing your laundry, or you need to make that phone call and schedule that appointment on your own. And, for a 13-year-old, that may be really scary. Okay. Let's see. I think I've about covered all that. So there is a lot of stress and anxiety that we wouldn't consider an anxiety disorder. Now, if any of those symptoms persisted over a really long period of time and started to impact day-to-day functioning, we would be a lot more concerned about it. Let's talk about some risk factors for children developing an anxiety disorder. So what takes those normal fears and creates a clinical problem out of it? This is some, not all of them. Sorry guys, genetics is probably the biggest one. So if you are a parent, if you have anxiety in your family, there is a strong likelihood that anxiety is going to be part of your children's lives too. Genetics plays a role. It's not the only thing, but it's a big part. Trauma, and that's any type of trauma, whether that's early childhood neglect, whether it's a history of abuse, whether it's a divorce situation that was traumatic for a child. Trauma is relative. I can't define what somebody considers a trauma. So anything that is impactful in that way can create anxiety over a long period of time. It persists long after the trauma's gone. Okay, a negative family environment, right? So y'all are all here. Y'all are interested in this in this information. So I'm probably not talking about to the right group of parents in terms of that. But we all have our stuff that goes on at home. Maybe it's we are quick to yell. Maybe we argue too much. Maybe there are things happening behind closed doors that create stress in a family environment. So if that's something that is persisting over time, your kids are likely to respond to that with anxiety. Social adversity. The older your kids get, the more likely they are to be anxious about social stuff. And it starts earlier and earlier. I used to think, mean girl stuff started in middle school. Now we're seeing it in 2nd or 3rd grade. It's earlier and earlier. they care about their peers, what their peers think about them, being left out from their peers, feeling like they fit in. All of that stuff is extremely important. Kids who are loners, kids who are isolated socially, those kids tend to have more issues with not just anxiety, but also depression as well. It's the whole "if you can be anything, be kind" situation with your own, when you're teaching your own kids how to interact with other people. It is absolutely true. Anxiety goes with other things. So if your child has a diagnosis of ADHD, if your child has a diagnosis of SLD, specific learning disorder, like dyslexia or dyscalculia, they're more likely to be anxious, right? School might not be a very friendly place for them if they have challenges in the classroom. School is stressful. I mean, think about the way that we feel if our job is stressful, right? School is their job at this age. So if it's not a friendly place where they feel competent, they're going to be anxious about it. We see it very comorbid or co-occurring with depression in teenagers. Has anybody ever heard of PANDAS? Do I have any PANDA parent? Okay. So PANDAS is an interesting, this is really rare, y'all, so I don't want everybody to go home and like WebMD this because it's really rare. It stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder Associated with Strep, PANDAS. And so in a very, very small subset of children, we'll see almost immediate onset anxiety after a case of strep. And it's typically things like OCD tendencies, tic behaviors, almost an immediate response. So it's very, very unusual, but it does exist. We're seeing more and more, I think probably just because we're more aware of it. Hormones. Sorry, women. Women were a whole lot more likely to have anxiety disorders than men. That's just our hormone profile. It's the way God made us. Our teenagers is the same thing. And again, we talk about stuff starting earlier and earlier. That stuff's starting earlier and earlier too. So, I mean, we're seeing in our girls, those changes are beginning not at 12 and 13, they're beginning at 9 and 10. So the hormone changes that affect our mood are also going to affect our ability to handle stress and anxiety. There are some medications that exacerbate anxiety too. The ones that we know the most about are stimulants that treat ADHD, our asthma medications, our corticosteroids, some seizure medications. Those tend to be the classes that we have the most data on that say, yes, there is an impact on anxiety. I have patients who had kids with asthma all the time, and it's like, I know that their asthma medication is amping them up and making them hyper and making them irritable. It's like, we gotta breathe, guys. Number one, most important thing, your child has to breathe. So we do the best we can with that, but, okay. So risk factors. Okay, so here's a list of some of the most common disorders that we see in childhood. And I'm gonna go through kind of each one of these individually. I didn't do a slide for somatic symptoms or PTSD, but I'll talk about those briefly. Has anybody heard of somatic symptom disorder? Anybody? That doesn't work in this field. So our brains have an uncanny ability sometimes of creating unusual symptoms out of stress, right? Very atypical presentations. So in somatic symptom disorders, our brain converts a stressor or an anxiety or a worry into a very physical symptom. And that can be things like pseudo-seizures, it can be things like migraines, it can be things like numbness or tingling in your hands, symptoms that feel very, very neurological. And you go to the doctor and the doctor says, there's nothing wrong with you. Your EKG or your whatever is fine, everything looks good. And oftentimes we see that those presentations are associated with anxiety. PTSD is now in its own category. It does not need to get left out. I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder, we are seeing more and more and more kids meet criteria for that, just because of, family, childhood dynamics, early abuse and neglect, just histories of childhood trauma the PTSD research is fascinating because it tells us that early childhood trauma, and they're actually beginning to look at prenatal trauma. So they're looking at our Hurricane Katrina kids and our 9/11 kids and following them. These are kids who were not even born when the trauma happened, but because it affected their maternal environment so much more, those kids are pre-wired for anxiety. right? Just because it affected them at that stage of development. So early childhood trauma is big. We're seeing more and more PTSD in kids. So generalized anxiety disorder is probably the one that we know the most about, right? These are our worry warts, you know? These are our kids who are worried about everything. Uncontrolled worry. If there's something to worry about, these kids are gonna find it. They're worried about school. They're worried about storms. They're worried about their grades. They're worried somebody's gonna break into the house. They're worried about injury. One interesting thing about these kids is they typically worry about very adult themes. Like these are the kids that at 7 and 8 years old are gonna be like, Mom, do you have enough money in your checking account? Or do we have enough gas in the car to get through the week? You know, it's like they are listening to adult conversations, and if they hear it, they are going to worry about it. So these kids are often really self-conscious. They doubt themselves a lot. They're not confident in their own thoughts and abilities. They need a lot of approval, a lot of reassurance. It's going to be okay. That's an irrational thought. That's not really going to happen. It's going to be okay. These kids often feel really, really restless, right? They have a hard time, just like adults with generalized anxiety. We have a hard time sitting still. We have a hard time really relaxing because that brain is always going with the next thing that I need to be worried about to try to grab control. They also have a lot of physical symptoms, right? These maybe are kids who present with, I have a headache today. I can't go to school today because I have a stomach ache. You know, they may be frequent flyers at the nurse's office. I don't feel good today. Something's wrong with me, that sort of thing. So generalized anxiety is our worriers. Let's see. Separation anxiety is interesting. We expect some of that at 2, 3, 4. We also see it in our teens. It looks a little different. These kids are very afraid of being separated from their parents or their caregivers. At 3 and 4, that may be, we don't want to go to the nursery at church. We don't want to go to grandma's. We can't be left with a babysitter. At school age, it might be that the car line people have to literally pull me out of the car every day because I don't want to get out of the car on my own. I don't want to go over to a friend's house. In teens, sleeping is a big part of this. These are kids who don't want to sleep by themselves. They don't want to be in the room by themselves. They may not go into certain parts of the house by themselves because it's scary. As they get older, it morphs a little bit. It's like, I don't want to be places without my parents. So I might not be the first to sign up for a summer camp. I might not want to go on that youth group retreat because I don't want to be away from home for a weekend. These kids worry that something bad is going to happen if they are separated from their parents. You know, and now with cell phones, you leave your kids, I don't know how, my kids aren't old enough yet, so I don't really know what the age is now that it's okay to leave your kids at home by themselves. I kind of feel like it's never, but, or at least societally, that's what it is. But this would be your 12-year-old being like, when are you gonna be home from the grocery store? How many more minutes? You know, have you gotten in the car yet? Are you on your way home? You know, I mean, that's those kids, you know, constant checking, constant need for reassurance that you're gonna be okay. Selective mutism is very rare. We do see it occasionally. We're going to see it present most often in a school setting. These are kids who talk at home and then don't talk anywhere else, or they have very specific places where they do not speak. It's not because it's not a language disorder. It's not a speech issue. They have the ability. It's just an anxious response that they shut down and will not communicate with you verbally if they are in an anxious or anxiety-provoking situation. Typically, we will see that at school. That one we don't run into very much, but it is out there. Oh, wait a minute. I went too far. Okay, social anxiety. When you hit about 8 years old, all the way through teens, all the way through adulthood. I mean, this one is pervasive, especially in the culture of social media that we live in today. There are 2 branches of social anxiety. One is what we think of as social, right? I may fear humiliation or rejection from my peers, right? They're not going to let me sit at the lunch table with them, or they're going to make fun of me for what I'm wearing, or I may get embarrassed in front of my friends. These are kids who don't like new situations. They don't like things like this, where I'm going to have to go and talk with people I don't know, things where you have to do any kind of unfamiliar social encounters with people. The other branch of it is performance related. So this is where test anxiety falls. Any kind of sports anxiety, things like piano recitals, class presentations, anything where someone is standing on a stage and people are looking at them, gives you that performance-related anxiety. So social anxiety we see a lot of in school-age kids, not just what we think of as the social, but also the performance. I'm afraid to be called on in class. I'm the kid that's going to try to hide in the back. I hope that my teacher never notices me, that sort of thing. All right, specific phobias. There are a lot of these. They all have funny names, whether it's spiders or heights or public speaking or doctors or, whatever the very specific fear is. And this is a specific fear that produces an immediate visceral response, right? If a kid is in the same room with a dog, immediately they will panic, right? They can't breathe, they're going to cry, they're going to try to escape, immediate fight or flight response. They will actively avoid the situation. So families will restructure the way that they do things to try to avoid, it's like, oh, we can't walk by that house because they have a dog, and the dog will bark at the fence and that's too close, or that sort of stuff. So it creates the situation where we're having to change what we're doing to accommodate this. And definitely the fear is out of proportion to the actual situation. We all have fears, right? I don't like spiders very much. I probably feel the same way about snakes, but at the same time, it doesn't create an immediate anxious response where I feel like I have to flee to my car, if somebody talks to us, talks about a spider, or even looking at a picture of a spider in a book. I mean, that's the kind of reaction that we're talking about here. Panic disorder. Anybody ever had a panic attack or want to admit it? I have, yes. Panic attack is interesting because it is panic about panic is really what it is, because you have a trigger that creates a physical response, right? Say, I'm going to go to Westminster Presbyterian Church and I'm going to present this information on anxiety to a bunch of people that I know, and that makes me feel kind of anxious. So in doing that, my heart may start pumping quickly and my breathing gets heavy and all of a sudden my palms get sweaty and I feel like I can't breathe. That's a panic attack, right? Panic disorder is when that starts to recur, and what happens is the brain and the body start to communicate and they say, oh, stress, panic attack, stress, panic attack. So instead of being able to cope with it, your body immediately goes into that panic response and you see all those physical symptoms. So you're worried about impending, it's like panic over the panic attack. Often this leads to agoraphobia. I mean, people that have really severe panic attacks will just stop going anywhere. I mean, these are people that don't leave the house or, can't interact socially because they're so afraid of what might happen if they have another panic attack. And OCD. Okay, so there's the TV version of OCD, right, that we all know, like the monk version, right? It's like we're counting, we're checking, we're turning doorknobs, we're not walking on the cracks. I mean, whatever it is that we're doing, those are compulsions, and those do exist. There's also obsessions. That exists solely up here. So you can be diagnosed with OCD without any of the compulsive behaviors. It can be purely obsessive thoughts. These are recurring, intrusive, negative thoughts. Maybe it's about storms, right? Storms is a big anxiety provoker around here. So you've got a kid that literally thinks about tornadoes all the time. Can't stop thinking about it. It impacts his day-to-day functioning. He can't turn it off. He gets referred to me for an ADHD evaluation because he's not paying attention in school. When we look a little bit deeper, we realize he can't focus because he can't stop thinking about storms or whatever it is this stressor is. That's obsessions. Typically with OCD, we'll see a combination of both of those things. These things are time-consuming and they interfere with day-to-day function. OCD is one of those that we all like to be like, oh, I'm so OCD, or oh, my OCD is kicking in. I mean, a little bit of OCD is good. We all want a little bit of it. It's how we get things done. But this creates a scenario where you cannot get through your day. It is so pervasive. It interferes with your ability to do anything. Okay. All right. Okay. So I found this great slide on Pinterest of all places. I was like, this is super research-based because it came from Pinterest. About what anxiety looks like in kids, and it's a little blurry. I tried to find it and save it all these different ways to see if I could get it to be clear, but it's not. Anxiety looks really, really different in kids. We just talked about a whole host of symptoms, but sometimes it doesn't even look like that. Sometimes it presents as something completely different. The desire to control people and events, right? Anxious kids often look really oppositional. You know, because they want things their way, right? Because if it's done their way and they're in charge, then their stress level goes down, right? Because I know what this is going to look like and I know how it's going to go. These are kids with sleep problems. They can't fall asleep, they can't stay asleep, they can't sleep by themselves. We'll talk about sleep more in a minute. I'm a sleep Nazi, so we'll talk about that in a minute. They may be really angry, right? You know, so anger is what we call a first level 1 emotion. There's always something underneath it. For some kids, it's a mood disorder like depression. For a lot of kids, it's anxiety. We're so stressed and edgy that one little thing can just send it all to pieces, right? Especially we think about that puberty age where we're all a little edgy anyway. Kids can be explosively angry, and it's all rooted in anxiety. They can be defiant, right? It goes back to that control. They're defiant because they're trying to grab control of situations in a world where they feel like they don't have any. That's what's happening there. Perfectionism, the one in the middle, having high expectations for self, including school, work, and sports. These are typically our kids who feel like perfection is right? If I am good or I am right, it is perfect. These are kids who don't make mistakes very well. These are kids who tend to be really rigid. These tend to be kids, and maybe adults too, I'll raise my hand on that one a little bit too, is that we may spend too much time doing something that doesn't require that amount of time because it has to be just so. Avoiding activities, we talked about avoidance. Anxiety at its heart is rooted in avoidance, right? Avoiding discomfort, avoiding fear. Pains like stomach aches and headaches, struggling to pay attention and focus. And so for somebody like me, who's probably 7 out of 10 patients that I see get referred to me for attention problems, right? We can't focus or we can't pay attention in school. The biggest thing I have to rule out is anxiety, right? If you're worried, if you're stressed, you cannot pay attention in school. That's very different from a kid who's daydreaming, staring out the window, thinking about Minecraft. I mean, it looks the same in a classroom, but it's different. We have to figure that out. Because if we treat anxiety with an ADHD medicine, sometimes bad things can happen. On intolerance of uncertainty, these are kids who are really rigid. They want to know what's coming. They want to know their schedule. They want to be able to plan. Don't change the game on them. Surprise parties, probably not so much. Not a good plan. Don't tell them that they're going to Chuck E. Cheese if you're not like in the car on the way to Chuck E. Cheese. I mean, you better be like 100%. Crying, difficulty managing emotions, over planning for situations and events, and then feeling worried, just a general feeling of worry. What I find with kids who are probably 10 and under is they have a really hard time verbalizing that they're worried. You can say, are there things going on that are stressing you out? Are there things that make you scared, make you feel worried, make you feel uneasy? And they have a hard time putting that into words. Typically, if you're a parent or you're in the school setting, you're going to see a lot of these other things first before you can begin to say, I think that this is rooted in anxiety. Okay, so this is where I really got stuck when I was putting this together because, I think as a covenantal school with covenantal families, we can't do a presentation on anxiety without talking about how this relates to our faith. My disclaimer on that, I'm not a pastor. I'm not trained in pastoral counseling. So dealing with this from a biblical, scriptural perspective is not my area of expertise. But where we are and who we're talking to, we can't leave this part of it out. So I tried to think about what I see kind of on on the other end of the desk, right? On the opposite side of the desk as to how these things kind of fit together. And messages that I think are important that we communicate to our covenantal children as far as anxiety goes. Anxiety exists because sin exists, right? Anxiety is not a sin, right? Anxiety exists because sin exists in the world, right? We live in a fallen, broken place. We have things like wars and cancer, and people get hurt and sick. And because of that, anxiety is part of being a human, right? So if your kids kind of are thinking, this is sinful, I shouldn't feel like this, as a parent, you kind of want to try to shut that down as best you can. You know, all of us are imperfect. We are all dealing with things because of our humanity and because we live in a sinful world. Anxiety is multifaceted, right? We've talked about the physical symptoms of anxiety. We've talked about the emotional impact of anxiety. It is also a spiritual concern. So we have to treat it in all three of those areas. So, and here's my, I don't have a soapbox to stand on, but if I had one, it would be on this slide. If you were diagnosed with cancer, and you walk over to the cancer center and your doctor hands you a prescription that says prayer, see ya, what would you do, right? You would find another doctor. You would get a second opinion. If we had a medical diagnosis, we would expect a medical solution or treatment plan for how we solve that. But so often with things like depression and anxiety, we address the spiritual, but we don't address the physical, and we don't address the emotional. So we're going to talk about prayer in a minute. It's critical, but it can't stand alone in helping our kids manage this. Self-care is God's care, right? God commands us to rest, right? We're not very good at that. None of us are. I'm not very good at that. My pastor on Sunday, I told him I was going to steal this from him, but he was talking about the difference of humans and the way that we work. You know, ancient humans, our workload was probably 90% physical exertion and maybe 10% mental, right? It's completely flip-flop now in this modern age. We're probably 90% mental fatigue and exhaustion, and maybe only 10% physical exhaustion. So how do we find that balance? How do we not just physically rest, but mentally rest and emotionally rest? We have to model that for our children. It's not always easy. Prayer is critical and very important. Prayer is, as Christians, is one of the most important coping mechanisms that we have. It's the foundation of our faith. It should be a foundation in our families. Be careful with prayer and the way that we teach our kids to pray, right? I know me personally, sometimes if I'm really anxious and I'm trying to pray before I go to bed, my prayer sounds like a laundry list of all of the things that I'm stressed out about. And then I try to close my eyes and I think, oh, I've just reminded myself of all of the stressful things that are going on in my life, right? That's not productive for me because I can't sleep. So for me, I have to pray in the morning, and I have to really think about what I'm asking God for, right? Am I asking Him to take away my stress? Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes I need strength to cope. Sometimes I need support around me. Sometimes I need to pray for my family. Sometimes I need to pray for my coworkers, all the people around me that give me tools to deal with what's going on in my life. And I think for our kids, it's the same way. Y'all off the top of your heads could probably think of 20 verses in the Bible that start with do not be anxious. Telling a kid do not be anxious is like telling an anxious kid that. It's like telling a diabetic, control your blood sugar. They can't do it. And what we don't want to do as our churches and people who are working with our children is to make someone anxious about their prayer life, right? Because we've said, oh, no, God's got it. Let go and let God. Well, if I'm 7 and that worry's still there tomorrow, what have I done wrong? right? How did I miss the boat here? What did I do? God didn't take this from me. And sometimes at that developmental age, it's really hard for a kid to think about, sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers, and sometimes he doesn't answer them in the way that we think he needs to. Those are really, really adult themes. So we have to be really careful in the messages that we're sending about anxiety and stress to our kids. The other thing about the ravens, we all know that verse, right? The ravens, they don't reap or sow, and they're taken care of. They don't do anything, and God provides for them. It's a great verse, and taken in the right context, I think it's a great verse. But it also misses the point, I think, about birds. Birds do not sit on a branch and wait for God to send them what they need, right? They fly. They gather food. Where do they go? If you ask a 6-year-old what a bird does, how they feed their baby birds, they're going to fly around and look for worms. A 6-year-old can tell you that. How do they make their nest? They fly around. They use the tools that God has put in their environment to create an ability to survive, right? They don't just sit there and wait for it to fall out of the sky. They use the gifts that God gave them, wings literally, and they fly around and they get what they need. God has provided what they need. They have to actively go get it. So sometimes I think when we pray or when we're talking to our kids about prayer, there's an active component there. What tools do we need to ask God for? What tools are in our environment that we may not have thought about using? That kind of thing. So this could be a whole class in seminary, and probably is. My perspective is very, very limited, and I could talk about this all day, but I won't because I'm running out of time. Okay, so as parents, what do we do, right? This is really why you're all here. We got 10 minutes to cover it. The first thing is basics. I put this in every report that I have ever done with, not every one that I've ever done, that's a lot, but almost every single one. Are we eating well? Are we sleeping well? Are we moving well, right? Our bodies are not active enough. None of us get enough exercise. So we all need to work on that, just as humans in general. Eating plays a bigger role than any of us would care to admit. And honestly, the medical research on things like anxiety is really beginning to look at things like gut health and bacteria, and you've probably heard the microbiome is kind of the hot word these days, about how what we're putting in our body affects our serotonin, our happy hormone, and our ability to manage our stress. So it matters way more than we've cared to talk about over the last probably 40 to 50 years in medicine. I find that for my patients, it's easier for them to talk about trauma than it is to talk about their diets. Like they would literally rather talk about child abuse than what it is they eat on a daily basis. They're like, please don't make me go there. I do not even want to talk to you about what we're eating. Consistent daily structure and routine. Kids need limits. They need to know what to expect. They need to know what's coming. Your anxious kids want to know what their day is going to look like. So even just in the car before you drop them off on car line, that reminder of, you're going to after school care today, and then we've got this tonight, or so-and-so's going to pick you up, and we're going to have this for dinner. Just the reminders of consistency in their schedule and routine. Okay. I almost wrote check yourself on this one, and I thought that was a little inappropriate. So check your own anxiety and stress, right? Anxious parents create anxious kids. It's not pretty, but it is. And there's actual research that says kids in treatment with anxiety, kids in treatment do better if their parents are in treatment too. So we know that parental stress plays a huge part in our children's stress level. So if you are the parent that is overreacting to small stressors, if you are the parent that feels like you are out of control, or you the parent that feels like you need your own help, get it, please. Your kids are watching you. You are modeling for them how it is appropriate to respond to stress. And we culturally, just kind of an aside, we kind of make a joke about this. We've got like t-shirts with hashtags, and it's like, hashtag mommy needs wine. It's all this kind of cultural stuff that we do that kind of minimizes, the way we as parents manage our stress, which is, we don't want to take ourselves too seriously, but at the same time, your kids are watching how you handle that. And so just kind of be mindful that if you're not using healthy coping skills, they're not going to either. Realistic expectations is huge, and I could go on about this forever. I have parents ask me all the time, these are kids with ADHD or learning issues, and they're like, so we shouldn't expect them to make all A's. And I'm like, yeah, no. No, that would be setting the bar a little too high. Know your kid, know what their goals are and what your goals are, and set expectations that are achievable, right? Do not sacrifice your child's mental health for their grades. Their grades may get them into college, their mental health will keep them in college. Do not do it, because then you're setting them up for a lifetime of overworking in a situation that they're not ready for. So, realistic expectations about everything. People ask me, well, how do you talk about this to your own kids? I say, try your best most of the time. And they're like, most of the time? I'm like, yeah, there's some areas where you're not going to give 100% effort, and that's okay. When you get to high school, you're going to have times where you have to decide what's more important to me. Where am I going to focus my effort? This is going to have to go on the back burner. That's okay. We're human. We can't do it all. Teach healthy coping strategies. We'll get to that in a minute. And then resilience. Okay. Everybody familiar with that term, resilience? Anybody? It's our ability to overcome adversity, right? It's our grit, our mental toughness. Kids cannot build resilience if they do not have opportunities to build resilience. So our parenting style these days of the lawnmower parent, we're not hovering anymore. Now we're mowing, which means that we're actually solving all their problems before they even see them. Kids don't ever even see that there's a problem because we've taken care of it before they even know it was there. Kids can't learn to take control of their world, right, and reduce their stress level if they're not exposed to solving their own problems, right? These are things that start at 7. They start at 8. I've worked with high school kids that literally have never made a phone call to an adult that was not related to them because they never had to do it. They're like, so I should just call the school to make an appointment? Yes, call the school to make an appointment. What? Very basic things that we think about that we do developmentally that we forget in this day and age because we've kind of decided that our job as parents is to make our kids' lives not just better but easier. If they're too easy, they don't learn these skills. And those kids are anxious kids, right? Because they haven't had the opportunity to build the skills that they need to be successful. So resilience is really, really important. This is a list of healthy coping strategies. These really don't look all that different from healthy coping strategies for adults, right? What do? How do we cope? Well, one, we need to look at things that bring us joy, right? Whether that's playing with an animal, whether it's listening to a playlist, whether it's talking to somebody that you know, whether it's being outside in nature. Know your kid. Identify the things that bring them joy. Now, if it's 8 hours of video games straight, that's a different conversation. So use your best judgment there as a parent on what is joyful. Movement is critical. Moving is our best coping. If we're moving and we're active and we're exercising, it will reduce stress. The other thing is what's going to distract, especially with our younger kids. We want to create an alternative activity that's going to distract from the stressor. So journaling, art, asking for a hug, resting, laughing, baking, whatever it is that's going to bring pleasure to that child and distract from a stressful situation. There are thousands of these, and it's kid specific. There's not just one answer that's going to be a fit for everyone. Where does prayer fit into that? It's the most important, right? There's a lot of research right now about mindfulness and meditation and how it actually rewires the brain to reduce stress. It does. Prayer can do the same thing. It's kind of, as Christians, that's our mindfulness, right? How we connect with God, how we're present and centered in our faith. These things, these healthy activities, these healthy coping strategies literally can rewire connections in the brain to reduce stress. Okay. What can the school do? And I know most of our teachers are actually teaching, so they're not here, but maybe they can watch this later. Hi, guys. Identify a staff member as a calming presence, and it may not be their teacher. At lower school, maybe it's Mr. Rubin, right? Maybe it's Coach Knight. Maybe it's somebody at the school, Miss Kathy. Whoever it is that the kids really, really connect with that can be that person's kind of calming person if they're anxious. Let them go talk to them. Discourage leaving school. So leaving school, and I think I missed this on the other slide for parents, but leaving school reinforces anxiety. We don't want to do that. So if a kid is anxious and we take them out of school, what have we told them? One, we've told them that their anxiety is legitimate, right? That was a real fear you had because you're now leaving school. Two, we've told them that other people can solve that problem for them, that they don't have to use their own coping strategies to be able to solve this problem. Parents do this all the time unintentionally. I'm as guilty as everybody else. A great example of it is sleeping. I had this family that their kid was afraid that somebody was going to come in their room at night, right? So they put a lock on the door. Kid was still afraid. They put a lock on the window. Kid was still afraid. They barricaded the door. Kid was still afraid. Parents moved in and slept on an air mattress in the kid's room. The kid was still afraid. They they bought a like $1,000 home monitoring alarm system, right? Kid was still afraid. So parents have lost hours and hours of sleep, spent thousands and thousands of dollars, and what we've done is reinforce the idea that this kid should be afraid, right? When instead we should have said, that's an irrational fear. Let's talk about how that's not going to happen. So in your own home, in your own life, think about the things that you're doing that may be subconsciously saying, oh yes, you should be afraid. You should be afraid to sleep by yourself. You should be afraid to go do that because I'm afraid to go do that. Things like that. Coping bags are great. Letting them use their relaxation or their coping strategies in the classroom. Regular contact and coordination with parents. It's really important that we're all on the same page. And I think one of the beauties of a school like Westminster is that the teachers, they know our kids, they want to know our kids, they want to be involved, and they want to let you know what they're seeing. So the more collaboration that you're seeing between parents and what's going on at home and at school, the easier it's going to be for that kid. In public schools, we use something called a 504 plan for anxiety. It gives us some accommodations in the classroom. If in the classroom it gets to be the point where we can't function, we may think about things like modified assignments or extended time to reduce stress or even distraction-free testing or things that are going to reduce a child's anxiety. Okay. I'm almost done, y'all, I promise. When to seek help? Use your gut. I mean, if you feel like there's a problem and you've exhausted all that you know how to do, talk to somebody. I mean, talk to your child's pediatrician, talk to a counselor, talk to your pastor, whoever you feel like is a good person to say, hey, this is going on. We've tried these things and we're having trouble. What do you think we should do? It may be that something like an assessment would help to try to figure out what's going on. Or it may be that just talking with a therapist is going to be the best way to help your child learn coping skills. But if it's affecting home life, it's affecting academics, it's affecting behavior, it's affecting their social life, it's time. It's time to seek help. Okay. Last slide, treatment options. The most effective, or at least what we have the most data on that tells us it's effective, is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the goal is changing your thoughts. If you change your thoughts, it changes your behaviors, right? So we're talking about cognitive restructuring. How do we say that is an irrational thought, or that is a negative thought, that is not a true thought? It feels true in your brain, it's not. Really, really effective. Somatic management is managing the physical symptoms, right? How do we physically calm our body when we're agitated? Social skills training for our socially anxious kids. Exposure therapy is great, and nobody really does it anymore. It's kind of old school, but I mean, it's the like straight up, you're afraid of dogs. We're gonna look at pictures of dogs, we're gonna watch a video of dogs, and in 3 hours, we're gonna put you in a room with dogs. You know, I mean, it's like we are gonna deal with this hard and quick. And it's so effective with kids. Assertiveness training, and lastly, medication options. I say lastly because just personally, I tend to be relatively conservative about medication. Medications can be life-changing for kids who need them. When used appropriately and correctly, they can make such a positive difference in the life of a child, an adolescent, an adult. The most common ones that are used are SSRIs, Benzodiazepines, if you have a doctor that prescribes a child a benzodiazepine, run in the opposite direction. Go, run out the door. I mean, that's your Xanax, it's your Ativan, it's your Valium, it's your Klonopin. High rate of dependence, high rate of abuse, particularly in adolescents. Guanfacine and clonidine and beta blockers are all geared toward reducing blood pressure, so it literally slows the body's physical response down. So it is designed to physiologically relax the body. So my recommendation, unless we're dealing with a crisis, for most kids with anxiety is to try counseling first, right? If changes in the home and changes at school and changes with a therapist are not enough, then it's probably time to talk about medication. And depending on the age of the child, you would want to get their input on that as well. So I am out of time, and that's a lot of information. So I will be happy to hang around for questions. I know it's a lot to take in and swallow, so if you have questions, let me know. I'll just kind of hang out around here. But thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to talk with you, and just hopefully you'll leave with something maybe that you didn't know and maybe a tool that you can take home. So happy Friday.